The sight lines to exit COVID are clearer each day, and Canadians are discussing and debating more than ever. What went wrong? What and who did things right? Who were the heroes and who were not? And what have we learned about ourselves? Cardus is in on this discussion, and no doubt these conversations collected from across the country will shape the future of Canada. Crisis is often a time for reflection, for renewal and rebuilding. Will you join me and stamp your fingerprints on Canada's future? Welcome, friends, to this first night of Exit COVID. I'm Michael Van Pelt, Chief Executive of Cardus, and we're glad you're here. Hundreds of us. We've gathered from across the country to think together about what has happened over the last 16 months. The disruption, uncertainty, the biggest crisis in our generation. A microscopic virus, sometimes deadly, often not, unleashed a cascade of consequences, leaving no sector unaffected, shutting down society as we once knew it. A worldwide pandemic gives us a glimpse to the fragility of each one of us and the social economic systems we inhabit. We've been made aware of what value we can lose so quickly. Finally, we're beginning to exhale. We're beginning to see some light at the end of the COVID tunnel. Now the time has come to discuss what comes next as we exit COVID. What kind of Canada do we want to live in and help build into the future? There are competing visions that will contest for the public buy-in. What is your vision? Tonight and tomorrow night, we want to listen to each other and to engage experts. This evening is a to-the-point introduction of many conversations we are going to be having in the months ahead. We will look at politics, the economy, education, faith, healthcare and the family, and we'll discuss with pundits and pollsters what Canadians think about the changes and trends we are witnessing or overlooking in society. You will also have a chance tonight and over the next few months to get in on the action and the conversation too. But first, I want you to meet someone who I regard as kind of scary smart and a really remarkable guy from Vancouver, British Columbia, raised in and about Calgary. Jeff Cowper, our board chair at Cardus. Jeff is one guy who can digest and dissect an obscure British poem and the latest Globe and Mail article all in one paragraph. Jeff is a partner at Fasken, one of Canada's leading law firms. He's chairing this 6-month initiative at Cardus at Exiting COVID. It's part listening tour, part research and intelligence gathering on critical issues affecting Canadians, like we're doing tonight. It will culminate in a major event in Ottawa in early November with an Exit COVID paper release and a big celebration when we hope to be together, really together, and not on screens. Jeff, welcome. We're so glad to have you with us tonight. Well, Jeff, help us set the table. What questions are you going to be paying attention to and listening for tonight? And furthermore, what's the trajectory of the headlines that you're going to be watching most closely as these months transpire, exiting COVID?
Well, I think all of us have been struck by how the barriers between our workplaces and our private spaces have been lowered by our experience of virtual work. Those of us who've been fortunate enough to continue working virtually, which is a lot of the country, much more of the country than I think we ever expected. And what I'm looking for is, as we go back to work, how is that virtual experience going to become generalized? How is it going to have long-term effects on the job market? Who has jobs and who gets jobs and who loses jobs? What does it do to our family life? I've been fascinated by the additional time I've been able to spend with my family when I've been virtually working from home. What is that going to do to family life? What is the mix of anxiety and reassurance that we get from our family in this sort of new virtual world we're in? What's it going to do to our cities? Everybody talks about how where we live is going to be different and how we live is going to be different. And I think that's not at all clear yet. And then finally, in church life, there are lots of churches who have reported much higher attendance by virtual attendance than in-person attendance. On the other hand, I wonder whether our community has missed the work that churches do in the community and how have they missed it. So that's going to be fascinating to see how churches come back to meeting together and returning to the civic work that every church gets involved in.
Jeff, I want to get back to that actual question a little bit later on, but just before we do, you were actively involved in forming and designing and a lot of the intellectual capital in terms of working with Dr. Rob Joustra on the white paper that we released yesterday. And one of the concerns that you had expressed consistently was how prescriptive are we? How hard do we push on a thesis? Or do we position this more as an expression of questions? And I know there was a kind of an attitude behind that, and it was an interesting dialogue, and I'm just let the audience in on kind of what you were dealing with in that questions versus prescription kind of approach to a discussion paper.
Well, I think we do our best work when we wait a bit, like when we're a bit patient to see what the facts are. I'm not at all certain that this pandemic has been of the scale and type that is spoken of every hour on CBC News. I'm not sure after the dust settles, we're going to look back and say, oh, this is the worst thing that ever happened since the Great Depression. I think we have to wait for the data, and I think we have to look carefully at it. Everybody has a stake in interpreting this, and so you find people that are rushing to the market to decide what it means. And I think that's my inclination is to immediately start interpreting it. And I think there's some wisdom in being a bit patient and looking at the facts. You know, I think there's some fascinating things that are going to come over the next period of time. I think we found out that we can scare a lot of people very quickly. And I don't know when people are going to be unafraid, but certainly so far, I think Canadians are still very afraid. It'll be fascinating to watch about when does that tip away and we start to return to normal, and what does that look like?
So when I was thinking about putting this white paper together, I had a vision for an idea buffet or a play-by-play guide or maybe an intellectual primer to help Canadians and to help our community think about how to exit COVID and what's really important for the future of our country. And there was a comment that you made on a number of occasions that struck me, and I've always wondered, why is this such a critical thematic as we're looking at exiting COVID? And you said to me, Michael, I think we've lost the sense of the sacred, even during COVID. And I don't know if that comes out of an emotional side of you or an analytical side of you, but what do you really mean by that loss of the sacred? Is that really the case? In some senses, crises often bring on more sense of the sacred, not less. What did you really mean by that?
Well, let me say that I think that if you look at the daily newspapers, you consume the media, you chat among people who will still chat with you. The one thing that's happened here is in an occasion of crisis relating to people dying, there has been very, very little in our general society about what that means, what life and death means for us. If you look at past historical crises, people have asked the spiritual questions. They've asked the faith questions repeatedly during World War II, during the Great Depression, during previous pandemics. I think that has been much less the case in the Canada of our age. And indeed, I think to some degree, the society's been reasonably hostile to people who feel like this does raise deep spiritual questions, and they've sort of been impatient for that. So I do think there's a sense in which our fellow Canadians do not understand that people of faith do things because they're people of faith, and not purely because it's the right thing to do from a utilitarian perspective or the caring thing, but that we're driven by the dictates of our faith, not just the Christian faith, but other faiths. And I think it's interesting to me how there's very little civic understanding of what people do when they're responding to a faith voice in their lives.
Jeff, I know we're going to jump into that issue, and I hope we do a lot more tomorrow and over the next months to come. Thank you so much for committing yourself to kind of leading this initiative, and I look forward to you joining us tomorrow night as well when we wrap up and get your perspective after these 2 days have been completed. So thanks very much, and we'll see you tomorrow night.
I'm all ears, Michael.
Wonderful. Also, throughout the night, we're going to hear from our discussion desk. Joining us now, let me introduce them. Dr. Lisa Richmond, our Vice President for Research at Cardus. Welcome, Lisa. And Dr. Rob Joustra, Assistant Professor of Politics and International Studies at Redeemer University, and the lead researcher of our just released white paper on Exit COVID. Welcome to you both. It's great to have you with us. I look forward to your commentary tonight as the night unfolds. Now, this is where you as the audience also come in. Our discussion desk will be monitoring the questions and comments that you send in tonight via chat on YouTube tonight. Something that might spark a question or a comment you can send to us by using the YouTube chat feature. If you're joining us on YouTube, you will find that by scrolling down and entering your question or comment. And if you're watching this at exitcovid.ca, click the button marked Interact on YouTube. That will take you to the YouTube channel where you can send us your comments and your questions. You will hear from our discussion desk throughout the night with your thoughts and their thoughts on exiting COVID toward what matters most. Robert and Lisa, welcome. I'm delighted that you're joining us tonight and all the work you've done to help this evening and our white paper be so successful.
Thank you.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
Rob, I want to go right into it. There is maybe a little bit of an overdramatic quote in the paper when you introduced it. And I'm going to read this quote and just test you on it a bit. Here it is. Imagine Canada like a car. We've just had a rare experience of smashing our economy, culture, society into a brick wall at hard speed or at high speed, either through the pandemic or by our response to the pandemic. And as crash test engineers, we now have to perform the analysis. What did we learn? What did we do? What performed better than expected? And what was worse? And more importantly, maybe most importantly, where do we go from here? Tell me, Rob, why do you think that our current moment is so ripe for such a dramatic response in this paper?
Well, look, I've got to defend myself from this charge of being over dramatic, or I'm never going to hear the end of it when I get home tonight. I don't think this is too dramatic of a phrase. In some ways, I mean, this is a kind of ripe moment of crisis. And with every crisis, I mean, you said in the introduction, Michael, there comes an opportunity. Really dramatic crises we call kind of apocalyptic circumstances, that Greek root with the word revelation. There's always this sense in which we are learning something about ourselves and about our lives together. When we come together. But you're right, COVID-19, doesn't have the feeling of the book of Revelation. I mean, this is not The Walking Dead. This is, a small sort of pandemic, even by comparison to the great crises of the 20th century. If we compare the crises that we've seen, what we've learned over the new millennium, from the geopolitical crisis of 9/11 to the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, right up to the medical crisis of today's, we have to say, and with respect, not to be disrespectful, but these are not dramatic crises like like the Great Depression or the wars or even the Spanish flu. And yet we have had this experience as a Canadian society over the last 16 months in which almost every aspect of our life has been transformed.
Yeah.
So is it too dramatic to say so? Maybe not if we do those historical comparisons, but at least by way of the present day experience, there's almost no part of our lives as Canadians that have gone untouched over the last 16 months.
In the paper, you refer further on in a number of occasions about using the language of stress test and whether institutions actually kind of succeeded in dealing with COVID-19 as a stress test. Really, what did you mean by that? Another kind of automotive reference, Robert.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, what I mean to say is, we've now gone through this experience where every part, whether it's education, obviously healthcare, but work and labor, all of these sort of different sectors. And I know we're going to have a chance to chat about a few of them in detail tonight. And of course, also tomorrow night, have gone through necessary alterations. They've been stressed. Enormously stressed. In some cases, we've discovered actually that some sectors, that we were better at some things than we thought that we were, which is an amazing thing. We could do some things we didn't think we'd be able to do. But in others, we thought, boy, we thought this would go better. We thought that our response would be better, or would be more coherent, or would be more effective. And what we found actually is that we still have a lot of learning to do. So this is really what I mean by a stress test. What can we learn from the way that these different sectors have undergone this really dramatic set of circumstances over the last 16 months?
So Lisa, there's in that kind of spirit of stress test, there's a lot of conversation and questions around the idea of trust. And those questions have been around for a long time, but now it seems to be accelerated. From your perch, how do you see the impact of COVID-19 on Canadians' levels of trust of basic institutions of society? Does it worry you? Is it temporary? Does it constitute a structural change in society? Give us a sense of your view of this trust question that just doesn't seem to want to go away.
Well, I'm really glad that we're talking about trust and that we talk about it in our paper. Clearly, trust is essential to the functioning of a liberal democracy, as we all know. I think we need to remind ourselves regularly about how precious trust is and how fragile it is. All things considered, I think that Canadians have a high degree of trust in one another, and we should be grateful for that. We should not take that for granted. During the pandemic, I think we have seen that, generally speaking, we do trust our neighbors to, for example, comply with the requirements that we've been given about wearing masks, staying apart, and so on, even if some citizens question the details or the need in some context. But I've been reflecting on one of our colleagues who you know who had an experience when his children were outdoors and playing with neighborhood kids a few months ago, and they were violating the lockdown rules in a minor way. And someone on his street who saw the kids called into the police to report them. And so the bylaw officer came to our colleague's door. Now, this neighbor who called in the complaint could have gone to our colleague and talked to him directly. And he could have said, you know, it makes me uncomfortable that your kids aren't following the rules. Could we talk about this? And he didn't opt for that sort of neighbor to neighbor approach. And I've been reflecting, well, okay, so why is that? Perhaps he didn't know our colleague very well, and he couldn't be sure that he could trust him to reciprocate with a neighborly response if he made a neighborly gesture. Now, in this case, our colleague is one of the nicest people we know, and I feel pretty sure that the conversation would have gone well. But my point is, we need to remember that trust is a two-way street. And when we think about the level of trust in a society, the question is typically framed in terms of how trusting is the average Canadian, or to what extent do they trust others? And we forget to ask the obverse question, how worthy of trust is the average Canadian? And of course, it's not prudent in important matters to trust someone who is actually not trustworthy. So perhaps this pandemic can help us to reflect on the question of, am I trustworthy? And that is something that we each have complete control over being. I can be a person worthy of others' trust if I decide to be. And just one more point on this, in our white paper, we reference a conversation with Yuval Levine. And at one point he says something like, I'm looking at the document now, we can focus on things that might happen, or we can focus on things we need to do during this pandemic or after this pandemic. And I really like that distinction. So being worthy of our neighbor's trust is one thing that we can do and that we need to do.
Robert, that was a pretty textured example of trust, or the lack of trust, kind of on the front line. And as academics and as think tankers, we often think of trust on a much more institutional and systemic way. Is there a link between the two? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the questions that I'm left with, and I completely agree with all of the things that Lisa said, which I think are really, really helpful. But one of the questions that I'm left with about trust is about different qualities and kinds of trust. So one of the ways in which, we'll see, and we'll leave we may have that conversation a bit tonight, where we saw that, and I think Lisa is right, that there was a high degree of trust on a kind of pragmatic basis on the part of Canadians with some of their institutions and some of their neighbors, that when we're trying to achieve very measurable technocratic goals, we have this kind of sense in which we pragmatically trust. But I wonder, is that the same thing as the kind of sort of almost more existential trust that you need that's actually at the foundation of what makes a society? It's the difference between, do I trust you with my RRSP and do I trust you with my son? Right? Do I trust you with my life? You know, those are two very different kinds of trust. And we may be doing really well in the one category. And it seems to me, actually, and that's a good news story. You said it was a hope-filled night, so let me have some hope here. That's a good thing. We should, it's great that we have, by and large, institutions that we have mostly felt Canadians can pragmatically trust to achieve certain kinds of measurable ends. But do we trust each other in this much more fundamental way? I don't know. And that, just my last point here, that connects to something that Jeff opened up with, which is, what are the sources to replenish that trust? When we have lost a kind of sense of sacred vocabulary, something beyond the mundane, the pragmatic that we achieve together, when we have lost a way to even talk about that, how can we build that kind of very basic foundational existential trust together? I think that's a really, really important question and a really hard one to measure.
Okay, you know what? We're just delving into this, and already we can see there's just so much to tackle. Lisa and Robert, part of your responsibility as well is to kind of track what our audience is submitting in questions. And yes, ideally we would get some of those tackled tonight, but they're not only going to form our thinking tonight, they're going to form our thinking all the way to November when we release our major report and develop our thinking and our thoughts and our points of view on how to exit COVID. So look forward to connecting with both of you later on tonight. Lots to talk about. Great start. Remember, you can send your comments directly to our discussion desk. I nearly forgot about that. You can use the chat feature. That's also part of the broadcast. I'd love to hear your comments and submissions as we travel through tonight and into tomorrow night. Our first panel tonight is tracking pandemic politics. It's report card season. How well did our governments, federal, provincial, and local do in weathering this storm? If we were to live through this again in our lifetime, what could or should be done differently with the advantage of hindsight? And what should be part of our exit COVID strategy now? We have a great panel to help us dive into these big questions. Joining us tonight is Sean Speer, Editor-at-Large at Hub and Professor of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and Ginny Roth, Vice President at Crestview Strategy, where she is also National Practice Leader for Government Relations. And of course, my colleague, co-founder and Executive Vice President, Ray Pennings at Cardus. Friends, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's going to be good. We're going to just jump right in here and hit the question. It's report card season. How did government do over these 16 months of COVID? It was a tough job, everyone would admit it, but how did they do? And I cannot help but go to an article in the National Post. Ginny Roth, it was a pretty dramatic title of the article. I'd love to hear if you're thinking the same thing now as you were thinking then. Rome is burning and we fiddle with lockdowns. Tell me about your report card of the COVID crisis and government's management of it.
Well, that headline was a bit polemical, and as Sean knows, that is the job of a good editor, is to get people to click on your column. So, but I was pretty worked up in that moment. My thesis at the time was that governments were obsessing about fiddling with lockdowns, which in almost every jurisdiction had ramped up and then ramped back down again, and there were these, exhaustive public debates about the minutia of that. Meanwhile, we weren't spending enough time focusing on and delivering vaccinations, which to my mind was really our only path out. And I think that's been borne out. And it's been just crystal clear in the last few weeks to what extent that was true. And I'll just say that's a good segue to my overall thesis on how governments in Canada have handled COVID, which is that it's a mixed bag. On the question of public health measures, there has been a lot of complaining, I think for good reason. I think the reason governments were perceived to have messed that up so much is because it wasn't easy. And hindsight is 2020, right? Early on in this pandemic, a bunch of the big public health questions were really hard. And we saw that, quote unquote experts from all sorts of different milieu were actually in disagreement, not just with each other, but sometimes themselves week after week. And so, yes, I think our leaders failed to take that information and provide leadership by stepping up, showing a bit of humility and saying, we don't know all the answers, but here's the path I'm going to try in our jurisdiction. Here's why. Follow me on this path and let's try it out. And we may have to adjust. We didn't see a lot of that. We saw a lot of deferring to the experts and using experts as shields, which becomes a problem because when expertise falls, you confront some of these, or when expertise comes up short, you confront some of these challenges that were talked about earlier with trust. And so I think there was a lot of failure on the health measures. On vaccination rates, though, I mean, if we want to be positive and optimistic, the last few weeks, we've seen really, really strong results. Canadians are getting vaccinated at a really fast clip. And that's meaning that our economy is going to be able to reopen, and in some places it has.
So Sean Spear, I'd love to hear your response on that. You have been actually on the other side. You sat down with the Prime Minister many times, dealing with difficult issues, facing the public, having to understand the complexities of actually getting out and solving an issue. Is Ginny just too tough on governments? Is she overlooking maybe some of the complexities that Canadians, including myself, don't necessarily see to be able to meet the many different and varied interests of that governments have to manage? What's your thoughts? What's the report card from your perspective?
I think what you say, Michael, is right. That this has been an evolving pandemic. Our knowledge about the virus has evolved in real time, and the government responses have adjusted accordingly over time. And it seems to me Canadians are, by and large, are prepared to have given Canadian governments the benefit of the doubt. And that's reflected first in some number of incumbent governments actually winning re-election during the pandemic, and in other cases where the polling in favor of incumbent governments remains pretty strong across the country, maybe with a small number of exceptions. More generally, Michael, let me just point out something that both Ginny has written and talked about, and of course is really core to the work of Cardus, and that is the question of state capacity. Canadian governments have rolled out various relief programs at pretty extraordinary pace in a pretty extraordinary circumstance, and I think it's fair to say that the development and execution of those programs has been generally successful. But in a range of other areas, procurement, logistics, operations, I think we've come to realize that our governments have less state capacity than many perhaps understood or thought. In effect, governments in Canada are pretty good at mailing out checks, but not very good when it comes to some of these operational or logistical matters. And so, when I think this is past us, Michael, and there's a proper assessment and valuation of the government's response, I think it will lead to, debate and discussion, not so much about how governments write checks, but how Canadian governments can strengthen their state capacity so that we're better prepared logistically and operationally for pandemics and any host of other emergencies where, I think on balance, our governments were ill prepared to respond.
Right. So Ray, it's report card time. I know you don't like them, but give us the report card.
I'd agree with Sean and Ginny in terms of both the providing of income support. Last March, when the pandemic came, we didn't know what we know today, and there was a sense of in the context of not knowing, shutting down an economy along the way. And the first thing you need to do is make sure that people continue to eat and have the income. the development of the wage subsidy program and the income support programs, as well as the rollout of the vaccination. Those are two programs that have seemed to have gone very well. That said, and it's very easy with 2020 hindsight, and I don't mean to sit on a panel and suggest that had I been there, all things would have been different and we would have foreseen all the others. That said, last April and May, I co-wrote with Rob Wildeboer, the chair of Martin Ria, 2 pieces in the Hill Times, which highlighted the fact that as governments entered in, you do not enter a war without an exit plan. And I think the government gets failing marks right from the beginning in terms of their failure to have an exit plan. You know, I think very quickly, you know, it strikes me that what they should have done at the beginning is have a very short-term, immediate sort of response to the day-to-day stuff, and they did that. We remember a year ago, the Prime Minister and the premiers were out every day providing some of the information. That was important. People in times of crisis want to know there's a hand on the wheel. They want to have a sense of empathy in that. They did the short-term and immediate stuff in those early days quite well, right across the board. But what they failed to accompany with that was sort of a medium and a longer term plan saying, okay, what is the objective? And they kept changing that. At first it was healthcare capacity, and we need to make sure for a few weeks that we've got the healthcare capacity so we don't get our ICUs overloaded like we were seeing in New Jersey and in Italy. Then after a few weeks, we moved to, to deal with flatten the curve. And we continued changing. And the reason we continued changing is we had not articulated sort of a short, medium, and long-term plan and how they fit together. And it's not as if government had to have all the answers on day one, but they had to articulate a framework. And as we move forward, fill in the details. And what happened is they didn't fill in the details. They continually changed the framework. So then we went to, red, green, yellow, and whatever. And then we went to stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. And we never understood where we were. We never understood what we were pursuing. And I would argue the failure of that goes not to immediate communication failure on the day, although we know that, there are lots of examples of that. That can be forgiven. Everybody's going to make mistakes along the way. I think the overall framework is we haven't seen a clearly communicated framework within which the short, medium, and long-term strategy was carried out. And because we didn't have the framework, we couldn't communicate it effectively. And that ultimately is a failure of leadership and deserves some criticism.
Okay, let me push back on that a little bit. And Ginny, I'd love you to jump in on this question about pivoting. In the business world, many clients of yours, we compliment them every single time that they can pivot quickly and change up plans and deal with their context that has changed and an external factor. And here we are taking government to pieces because they didn't change quick enough, or they didn't have a steady forecast on what was happening. Are we being a little too tough on governments dealing with intractable problems like COVID-19, or is Ray's assessment reasonable?
I think it's reasonable, and the reason I think that is because one of the big takeaways for me on the what next question. I don't want to jump to your next question, but I'll allude to it. Is I think what COVID has done is given us an opportunity in that it's brought forth some of the emerging changes globally, domestically in Canada that were already happening, and that politicians and the people around them were, I think, have been slower to take note of, particularly in Canada, where we have a lot of stability for a lot of reasons, our banking system, and there are all sorts of reasons why we're more stable here in Canada. So big changes that happen globally come a little bit slower here, and that's a good thing. But they are still happening. And I think our politicians have been remiss in missing that and not trying to dig in and look at where some of those things exist. So my big takeaway with COVID is there are really two totally different experiences of COVID, depending on what kind of life you live in Canada. There were people, frankly, I think in a lot of cases, people on this panel and people listening in who have white collar jobs, who are able to work from home, who may be fortunate enough that their children are in private or religious schools, who who saw their stock portfolios increase in value, who saw their homes increase in value, who spent more time at home with their families, et cetera. And then there were essential workers who put on their boots and went off to dangerous workplaces every single day, whose kids, teachers in the public school system were effectively on a de facto strike in a lot of cases, undeclared strike, and who weren't being educated for almost 18 months. We had small business owners who couldn't open their businesses, and their employees who were laid off. And those people's experience, many of whom don't have savings, didn't accrue any value in their lives, had a completely different experience of COVID. And that's not just because of COVID. Those differences already existed, but COVID has turned our eyes to that in a way that I think we can't be blind to anymore. And we've always told ourselves as Canadians that we don't have the inequality issues that our American cousins do. And we may not when it comes to GDP and straight income, but when it comes to the lived experience that I'm talking about and the civil institutions that are meant to help people thrive, we come up really short. And so we can, you could talk about housing prices and access to education and that sort of thing. But I think until politicians realize that and take COVID for the opportunity that it is and turn their mind to those big questions, I think they will have missed a big opportunity and failed people coming out of this pandemic.
Michael, can I jump in on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
In terms of, I agree entirely with Ginny's bifurcation of how, there were two COVIDs. In a newsletter earlier this year, I actually described the two groups that Ginny highlighted. But I also think you need to overlay a rural-urban dynamic on it. And it speaks back to the earlier thing of the limits of government. On the one hand, yes, COVID is obviously a virus that as people try to move from region to region, interact with each other, there's risk of transmission. I have two homes, one in Ottawa, one in Hamilton. And what's the irony is the different experience that I had in those two cities. On the one hand, living in most of my interaction in the greater Hamilton is by and large a suburban, quasi-rural community that really did not have a lot of experience with COVID in terms of direct. It was people heard of, but most people do not know many people who died from COVID or were hospitalized. And there was a very different, and you could go more rural. I think of the reports in rural Manitoba and rural Alberta where for extended periods of time, there was 0 cases in given communities. And yet there were what were felt to be, absolute unnecessary, draconian lockdowns in a situation that didn't seem to make sense. And that is part of the challenge of when we deal with government. Now, obviously, mobility was a significant issue in COVID, and we can't just turn a blind eye. But there's a very big difference in the lived experience between my neighbors in the greater Hamilton area and my neighbors in Ottawa. I happen to know 8 people who've died of COVID and 13 people who've been in ICU. And my neighbors in Ottawa are feeling very different about, everything from wearing masks and all the rest. It was a very different experience in the two cities. And part of that was urban-rural, as well as how they were affected from a social economic status as well.
Thank you, Ray, for this. Sean, can you pick up this question a little bit from a different angle? I want to compare civil society and the condition of civil society with the condition and the progress and the success of government. In one way, I sense a crowding out of civil society. Government, I can remember the first announcement of the Prime Minister. It was a powerful announcement. It was, we will take care of you. But when I thought of that announcement, I thought, okay, will you take care of us? And where is civil society's responsibility and our own responsibility to take care of us? How did that balance work between the strength of civil society, the role of government? Was there crowding out? Give us your assessment of that.
It's a great question, Michael. I'm just trying to think about how I would satisfactorily answer it. I would say that early in the pandemic, I'm thinking now, late Q1 2020 or Q2 2020, I think we saw, the kind of expressions of solidarity, in Canada and elsewhere. I think, for instance, of the images of people banging pots, to recognize the enormous contributions that nurses and other medical professionals were making on our collective behalfs. And I think of the role that small local charities were making in ensuring that people had food and basic necessities, including different forms of human interaction. And so I think in those early days, notwithstanding the observations from Ginny and Ray about the kind of bifurcation of COVID experiences, I think there were sincere and genuine expressions of solidarity. For various reasons, I think that sense of collective sacrifice and collective commitment to one another diminished over time. And it'd be fascinating to hear not just the thoughts of the panel, but others who are participating tonight on what may have contributed to that. I spent some of the pandemic, Michael, in the United States, including through the election cycle and, of course, the killing of George Floyd and the demands for racial justice that followed. And so, it's easy to see the forces that pulled at those early expressions of solidarity in the U.S. In Canada, it's a bit harder, I think, for me to discern. But maybe just setting those observations aside for a second, I do think that notwithstanding limits on physical gatherings, some of the financial challenges that many Canadian charities faced because of the pandemic-induced recession, I think civil society in general held up well and exhibited the relative strengths of civil society interventions, including some of the issues that Ray mentioned in his answer about, one of the limits, of course, of government action is the tendency towards standardization. What we often describe in the world of think tanks and public policy as one-size-fits-all solutions. And in a circumstance like COVID, there were, that's a pretty blunt force instrument, whereas civil society groups, whether they're faith-based ones or secular ones, were able to respond in a way that was more reflective of community or individual or household needs. So I think, on balance, the pandemic has, I think, affirmed many of the underlying hypotheses of the kind of Cardus model for thinking about the role of civil society. But let me just wrap up with this observation, Michael. What's fascinating, one of the, it's often said that a government budget isn't just about revenues and outlays, it's about an expression of values. And, while we didn't have a budget for some time over the course of the pandemic, governments were obviously spending at extraordinary rates. And I think in how that spending was designed and who was targeted tells us something about the responsiveness and representativeness of politics. Virtually every group and sector was, in effect, recognized in the form of COVID spending. But one that was neglected, of course, was the charitable sector. Yeah. And this is something that, of course, Cardus did important work on and continues to do important work on. And, one can't help but think that that's a kind of telling omission, that the government neglect of the charitable sector, in particular in civil society, more generally at this extraordinary time of need, just reflects the tendency on the part of policymakers, both elected and non-elected, to fail to see the kind of crucial role that civil society plays in the lives of Canadians, and one hopes that the experience of the pandemic may cause some people in power, in political and governmental power, to truly see how crucial civil society was for material and non-material needs of Canadians.
So I want to, in the last minutes remaining, I want to get a sense from all three of you what you would advise the government to do. What's the message that you would say if they were paying you the millions for the best advice in the world, what is it going to be? But before we do that, just a quick shot. We cannot do this without talking about debt and without talking about inflation. I listened to the budget. I read a good chunk of the paper, the budget itself. We can spend a lot of money, and Michael, you don't need to worry. So, Ginny, can we spend a lot of money, and do I need to worry?
I think we can spend a fair bit of money, and you don't need to worry. But there are limits to that, obviously. And I think I was just listening to a podcast about how President Biden had to kind of cool his heels a little bit on some of his ambition, because he listened to the business community who said, look, we're a bit worried here, pump the brakes. And there was some brake pumping, depending on how comfortable you are with spending. And so I'm hopeful that major governments, including ours in Canada, will be cautious about that.
Sean, spending, debt, inflation.
I'm concerned, Michael, as I suspect a lot of people watching tonight are as well. It's not to say that we're entering a fiscal crisis, but if there's anything we've learned over the past 12 months, it's to budget for the unexpected and the extraordinary debt that we've accumulated over the course of the pandemic. But the truth is, the spending trajectory that we were on even prior to the pandemic is going to necessarily impair our ability to be ready for the next crisis, including some pretty predictable ones, such as the rising share of provincial spending that's consumed by healthcare because of demography. So I think now's the time, it seems to me, to sort of protect ourselves so that we're ready and able to respond to future crises like the one we've just gone through.
We're running out of time here. There's so much to talk about. Let's move to your $1 million advice to the government, and we'll start with Ray. 30 seconds, Ray. What's the best advice you can give our government leaders today?
I think one of the things is have a sense of modesty about what government can do and bring in partners in terms of civil society. I think this has been a pandemic in which the results have been divided between the strong and the weak. Those who had strong families, strong communities, strong workplaces, strong faith communities, they actually have done reasonably well, and they will survive and perhaps even thrive as a result of it for various reasons. Whereas there are many in our society who did not have all of the above. They are hurting, and the temptation is government can think they can help them, and they can't. They need to actually invest in the institutions that'll make things different.
Your advice, Sean, 30 seconds, and include Frontier Agenda if you can.
Yeah, I think that the problem facing the country prior to the pandemic and after the pandemic is a crisis of confidence, the lack of a collective sense of national purpose. We need a new frontier. And, I would make the case, Michael, that can come in the form of a public-private partnership focused on oceanic discovery. Others might have different views, but it seems to me that's the crucial question. How do we restore a collective sense of national purpose in Canada?
And Ginny, your best advice in 30 seconds to our government leaders.
Well, I'm glad that Ray and Sean contributed what they did, because then I can go with my niche issue, which I don't really think is so niche, which is that fertility has been declining in the Western world for years, and COVID, by all appearances, COVID's made that worse, including in Canada. And we can't thrive as a country unless we grow our families and our population, and we can't take care of our aging population if we don't have more babies. And government doesn't play a direct role in that, but they can make it a lot easier if they make people able to afford homes, and if they support people who want to go about family formation.
Wow, Ginny, that was a whole new conversation. You surprised me with that one, but right on. Thank you very much.
I'm glad I squeezed it in.
Ginny, thanks so much for joining us. Sean, thanks so much for joining us. And Ray, we'll catch you later during this broadcast as well and into tomorrow. And we're really grateful for this conversation. So, Now over to our discussion desk again with Lisa Richmond and Robert Joustra. And let me remind you, we want to get more questions from you. We're getting lots of questions already. This is a way we can get input from a much broader sector of society and think about those implications for the future. Well, Lisa and Robert, that was quite a conversation. Where do we want to jump in? Where do we want to jump in first? I can't help think, Robert, about the question around the size of government. And you know, it's easy for conservatives to say we need less government. It's easy for liberals to say we need more government. And how do you see that question in a COVID-19 experience, and what does that mean from your perch?
Yeah, and let me maybe by way offer a little bit of a modest defense for the different levels of government in Canada during this pandemic. Michael, you opened up and said it's report card time. Nobody likes report cards. I love report cards. As one of my favorite board members here at the university likes to say, the only thing left to do is assign blame. You know, this is an opportunity to kind of constructively see what went right and what went poorly. I think when we're talking about government and we're talking about the size of it, one of the things that sometimes gets missed is that government is not one thing. And we talk about this in the paper, actually. I think it's a really kind of constructive formulation. It's not always just about, you know, download, the kind of conservative mantra on this. Sometimes it's that actually government needs to be the appropriate size in order to achieve the goods it's trying to achieve. Sometimes that means large, systematic, slow bureaucracy, right? I don't want too much innovation from Revenue Canada, right? I want it to be systematic. I want it to be fair, right? But when it comes to vaccine procurement, when it comes to, for example, the delivery of healthcare, we actually already have a model that says, you know what, we might need a little bit more downloading, and that's going to need to be a provincial jurisdiction. And maybe we need to think about jurisdictions even below that. So on some level, you know, part of my defense, at least of our levels of government, is that I think, did we find that they failed, or did we find their limits? Did we find the limitations of the current kind of government that we have? And do we in fact need to be thinking about what sort of government is needed for what sort of problem, the right tool for the right job?
Fair argument, Rob. And Robert, I'd love to explore what that means in more detail as we kind of walk through this, because it is a central question. Lisa, I want to share a question that we've got from the audience among many questions, but I think this one just kind of a poignant question. Is our society in love with being safe? It gets back to this strength of civil society question. Is our society in love with being safe? If so, how do we become a courageous country again? A little bit of a touch or an irony to that question. What's your thoughts on that?
Right. It implies that yes, that taking risks, yes, so there's good risks, obviously, and then there's courageous risks, the right kinds of risks. But are we in love with being safe? Well, from what I have heard about changes in parenting over the last number of decades, it seems like we're raising a younger generation with a great deal of concern about safety. But on a societal level, perhaps it's a reflection of the fact that a lot of things are becoming safer and safer in our daily lives, and so we just expect that that's going to continue. And then something like a pandemic happens, and it is so outside of our frame of reference, or we feel so helpless because of it, so amorphous and all around the globe and so on. I think, yeah, I think I'll just stop. I think I'll just stop there. But that's a great topic.
Lisa, I want us to explore at some point as we move along here this relationship between safety, this relationship between concern, prompting of anxiety, prompting of the feelings of isolation. I think there is a link to those those kind of questions. Robert, we dealt with this in the paper itself, in the white paper itself, this preoccupation with health, maybe being a focus on just the drama of life itself, less than the meaning of life itself. Any thoughts on that? It's we're going philosophical fairly quickly here, but it's worth jumping into.
Yeah, that's all right. I don't mind a little armchair philosophy. I think I agree. I think it was Sean who finished off making his conclusion, and I think he was talking economically, but I think it's true on this question too. There's nothing wrong with safety, but then the question becomes, well, what purposes or goals, are we willing to take a risk on? What's worth taking a risk on? We all have individual answers to that question, but really the question that's in front of us is, do we have a broad social answer to that? Does Canada have an answer to that? And it seems to me it's not entirely clear that we do. Do we agree on a national purpose, on a national kind of essence that is so important, that is so fundamental, that actually we would go outside of our safety threshold in order to accomplish it? And I think that's a tremendously important question for any nation state, but I think especially for a country like Canada.
Okay, I'm going to pick up with both of you later on as we get into the evening and close the evening. Thank you for this. There's so many questions that we should be tackling here. I love the prospect of us taking a good crack at it, so hold tight. It's easy to overlook the pandemic that hit many Canadians' pocketbooks and bank accounts really hard, especially for those who lost their businesses and their jobs. This impact was spread unevenly, hitting some much worse than others. And for those carrying significant debt, those struggles may be far from over. Our next guest can help us gain insight into how these Canadians are managing difficult financial times. Joining us now to talk personal finance is Michelle Pommells, the CEO of Credit Counseling Canada. They help tens of thousands of Canadians each year put plans in place to get out of debt and walk toward financial stability. Michelle, I'm just delighted that you're here with us and willing to have a conversation about what happens at the kitchen tables. And I'm wanting to ask you about your Globe and Mail article that basically kind of argues that consumer debt has gone into overdrive. But I want to ask you what that actually means at the kitchen table. What does that actually mean in many people's households?
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm glad to be here today. Well, if you were to ask me that question pre-COVID and during COVID, I think I would answer it in different ways. Prior to COVID, we, from our work with a lot of Canadians that reach out to us because they are struggling with debt issues and have essentially no clear idea, one, what they owe, and two, how to tackle their debt problem. And we see that this problem cuts across all demographics. And we are also very alarmed by the fact that not only are the debt levels increasing over the past 10 years, but people are getting more deeply into debt than they have ever been since Second World War. So this is something that we monitor very closely think of it from a civil society standpoint. We can see that the needle has swung away from some of the sort of back to basic, spend what you earn, to more of an idea that consumption is king, and that it's perfectly reasonable to go through decades of one's life servicing debt. So this is something that we're quite concerned about. We take a financial literacy or money management perspective in helping Canadians break free of debt and understanding the principles and the risks associated with high levels of debt.
So on the consumer spending file, let me ask you about that. It's the data is suggesting that many Canadians are saving money. They've saved more money during COVID than they've ever saved in their lifetime. They're not spending, they're being more prudent with their financial resources. Is this showing up at all in your data? And are we potentially seeing some Canadians actually in a much more positive situation from, let's say, your own mission with respect to financial responsibility, and a whole other set of Canadians actually in a much more difficult spot? Is this a polarization of credit?
It really is a tale of two cities. And, some of your earlier guests alluded to this. For some Canadians, they managed to weather the storm of the pandemic the last 14 months or so reasonably well. It tend to be white-collar workers who have not seen a reduction in their work hours, or they're not working in retail or emergency sectors, or precariously employed. Working in the gig economy. So they've been insulated in large part by the sort of financial difficulties that the second set of Canadians have experienced over the last 12 months. I want to put it into context, first of all. In the past 16 months, the restrictions have upended Canadian finances, with Canadians now carrying 2.1 trillion in debt in the first quarter of 2021. That's up 5% from a year earlier. So I would say that Canadian debt levels remain higher than we would like to see. And when you look at some recent data that's been published by the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, FCAC, 36% of Canadian households have said their debt increased over the last year. And 30% of those people experienced a reduction in paid hours. That equates to 75% of Canadians saying that they are stressed, more stressed now than since the pandemic started. So that's a sizable proportion of Canadian families who have been impacted, especially two-headed household families. So it really is a dichotomy or a polarization, depending on who you're speaking with. We tend to see and work with Canadians who fall into the second category of consumers that are struggling with debt issues.
So that tale of two cities, the one city, is it government regulations that's going to solve this problem? Is this a cultural problem? Is this a legislative problem? What's your instinct? You said in the Globe and Mail article that there's no panacea to solve this problem, but give me some possibilities here. Is there regulatory or legislative options here that can help Canadians in this space?
I don't think there's a magic bullet. It's more a tapestry of different solutions. So the answer is yes to all of those different levers and strategies. Certainly what we would like to see is more of a collaborative approach between government and civil society, between not-for-profits and charitable organizations that are working within local communities, understand the needs of communities, and have been working, in our case, for over 50 decades in local communities across the country. Instead, what we're seeing is more of an inclination to a cookie cutter type of approach, spearheaded, by various government initiatives that are currently squeezing out a lot of charities. I think one of your guests alluded earlier to the fact that one of the sectors that seem to have missed out on the support that the government has provided over the past 16 months is the charitable sector. Certainly for our sector, which is the non-profit credit counseling sector, and many of our members are charities and non-profit. In fact, all of our members fall within that category. In the last 2 years alone, we've seen 10 agencies close their doors. The reality of that is it means that local communities are no longer able to access that invaluable resource because these organizations, this sector is not being adequately supported by government. I think it's a trend that we're seeing across many charitable sectors, frankly, and it's something that we're going to be looking at to raise some awareness around, because we feel very passionately that Canadians, and whether you're struggling with debt issues or not, should have access to choice. And one of those choices is charitable non-profit credit counseling services, which have their roots in a sort of grassroots movement from the Depression, recognizing that there were people in the community who were struggling that needed help. Today, our industry has faced a number of different headwinds that have created the kind of situation I just described. Having said that, in the last year, we've assisted over 4,000 Canadians to access debt deferral programs to help them cope with the challenges that the COVID-19 has presented to their households.
Michelle, let's go over to the other city for a moment. Many Canadians that are watching and that are in our world, they've been able to keep their jobs, and many of them have grown their bank accounts. What would you say to them, to this situation? We know that credit issues and financial issues are often very relational. They're not abstract issues. So what's the message? Talk to us as Canadians who have kept jobs, who've kept our bank accounts and have in fact grown them. How can we help?
I think when we look at COVID-19 exit, I think there's a huge opportunity here. Canadians have learned a lot during the past year. They've learned that they can probably, manage to do perfectly okay with less consumption, more time with family, going back to some of those basic values that are sort of built the country. And I think a lot of Canadians have learned that it's a question of priorities, and whether you're on that up side of the K or the down side of the K, I think those lessons have been learned. We see there are some risks, right across the segments. We work with all demographics, so we see debt problems with youth, with seniors, with adults. It really, runs the whole gamut. But with the folks that have weathered, COVID-19 more resiliently, if they're homeowners and they've seen a major appreciation in the worth of their assets from the hot housing market, we would invite these households to bear in mind or to plan for corrections. So rather than acquiring mortgage, the biggest mortgage that you could possibly afford, we'd really recommend acquiring a mortgage that's a little bit under your debt weight, so that you've got that resilience, you've got that comfortable cushion to be able to withstand whatever happens over the next couple of years, whether that be a softening in housing prices or an increase in mortgage rates. Even an increase of a few basis points on mortgage interest rates will cause a number of householders to be in real difficulties, especially those households who are first-time buyers, millennials, young families who, quite anxious to get into the housing market, possibly relied on parents to help them to make that transition. And they're on the sort of outer curve of the stress tests, just managed to squeak by, and every single penny counts towards their mortgage. This group is particularly vulnerable, and so we encourage Canadians to take the lessons that they've learned during the pandemic in terms of savings, budgeting, and continue those practices, even while we move towards a recovery.
Michelle, thank you so much for this. May you and your team have good courage as you sit with people at those kitchen tables. This is tough work, but it's really important work, and it's hopeful work for the future. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
One of the biggest disruptions that COVID-19 introduced was schooling. Schools were closed, laptops were open, and remote learning became routine in many households. Parents were thrust into new roles, students missed their friends, and social time became screen time. Parents were often overwhelmed balancing their work with new work of becoming substitute teachers at home. What was lost in terms of education for our children? What was gained in terms of lessons learned for the next time? And what did COVID reveal about problems and inequities that existed before the pandemic? Let's listen in on a conversation about that and more. We're joined now by Dr. Ashley Berner, a Cardus Senior Fellow and the Director of the Institute for Education Policy at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. And Dr. Deanie Van Pelt, President of Advanced Christian School Association, Senior Fellow at Cardus and Visiting Scholar at the University of Cumbria. Deanie and Ashley, I'm so delighted just to listen in on this conversation about education. So let's have a close look at it. With COVID's impact on schooling, what really got lost? What kind of learning losses were there, and how did it impact families today? Ashley, why don't you jump in?
Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you all at Cardus. I'm pleased to be part of it. So at our institute, we focus on the core things that schools can provide, namely a strong liberal arts curriculum or a robust curriculum and a strong school culture where all the stakeholders are aligned. And those are the two things that schools of any kind, whether it's a district school, a Catholic school, a Protestant school, an Islamic school, Jewish school, all schools can, as it were, pull those levers to advance students' learning and civic capabilities. So what COVID really showed us is the disparity between school systems that had put those in place and those that did not. And that's on the school side. Also showed us disparities in terms of what families need by way of support. There were well-resourced families that could pick right up and give their kids tutors or put them in a private school that stayed open when maybe the district school didn't, and other families who didn't even have access to the internet. So I would say the learning loss itself has not really been adequately measured yet, but we know it's significant. I would really say the real loss is actually it's somewhat of a wake-up call to schools and also to our society about the inequities that really pertain.
Deanie, 16 months of disruption in education in Canada. What really happened?
Yes, indeed. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me. Great to be here with you as well, Ashley, tonight. I have had a front row seat to a small sector of independent schools in Ontario. And while many in other systems lost months of schooling, our analysis and our study of that sector of schools, so again, it's a small sector representing 15,000 students, up to half of them did not lose a single day of instruction with the pivot to remote learning. Were these schools well-heeled? Is it wealth? Is it some kind of extraordinary income or cash sitting around that explains it? Absolutely not. These are small, autonomously run, independent schools where the parents are known to the teachers, work with the teachers, and the teachers canceled March break, pivoted to design their classes, and within a few days after the March break, they were able to be up and running. So we know it's possible for schools to not lose instruction. We know it's possible for schools to stay in touch with kids. These are schools that they educate at about $9,000 per student. So yes, that's a lot of money for some families, but when you look at that cost overall, it's not a $49,000 price tag to attend a school where education wasn't interrupted. Why is this important? It tells a story that it's possible in times of crisis for excellent education to continue to happen. And I think the hopeful story coming out of this is that if we pay a little bit of attention to what happened in those circumstances, we've got some insight as to what can happen in all circumstances. What are the keys? And I think there are two keys which I'd be happy to talk about.
I want to dig deeper, a little bit more into the disruption side of this, and then maybe we can have some further conversation on how we can exit COVID in the educational systems. Tell me about digital technology and our ability to integrate that with no notice at all. Were we successful? Deanie, I noticed your kind of reference in the pandemic pivot paper that there was some reasonable success, but I'm not sure parents are all on track with that kind of assessment. What have we learned there, and what really actually happened?
Me? I would say in the States, there's, I mean, again, this notion of the disparities, the schools that went into the crisis with really great curricula that the teachers were prepared to teach, in many cases had online lessons too. That was an easier shift. The schools that had a strong school culture, where the parents, like as Deanie was saying, everyone is there's a shared mission, there's a shared vocabulary, there's a known, their children feel known, and we've seen these differences across every school sector. Those schools fared better. I would say the fact is we still have digital deserts in our country. Every state has a rural community that is not well connected. And that's where there was a real crisis, because no matter how great the curriculum was or wasn't, teachers were having to photocopy it, distribute it to families. Families were having pickups. That was the first problem. This very real issue of a digital desert. And there are philanthropies that are stepping in to try to address that. So, that's the one problem, is just capacity. And on the other hand, the kids who are used to being social, the more extroverted kids, really have been harmed by the constant online, digital approach. There's been a rise in teen suicides and teen, eating disorders, and we just don't know what the consequences of going fully remote have been yet. But we know there's been a cost there, even where the digital quotes pivot was successful. So
I think Ashley, Ashley, I think you're right on. We can't minimize the awful losses that happened, learning losses. And I'm so excited about the work you're doing, talking about not only like remediation, but you've got some really exciting plans that I think I've caught wind of about really accelerating learning. And I think we can't minimize the losses that have happened socially or academically. But I think for me, the hope is knowing that in those places, as you say, where there might have even been a digital desert, parents work together with teachers, and there were package pickups that happened on a very regular basis. People pitched in. The board of governors of a school suddenly moved from more of a governance mode to I guess we'll roll up our sleeves as well. It was like, and the staff, had to be laid off in these schools. So it's not even like they increased the staffing. There was no government funding from the province for any of these schools towards any of the costs of the health and safety measures. They just came together as a community, and they were able to weather a crisis. And now throughout this past year, we've seen that I've heard that homeschooling in Canada has doubled. Official homeschooling, however we define official homeschooling, has doubled. And the schools that I studied, we noticed that 70% of them had at least a 10% increase in enrollment. So as things are settling down, parents are looking beyond the state for the education of their kids. And so they saw that early pivot, the well-being. then they're moving to something else. But again, I don't see that has to be the answer. Sure, possibly that's what worked now because state did, as one of our earlier panelists said, have a limited capacity to respond in a time of crisis. But I think the hope here, and Ashley, you're going to be a big part of that solution, is that going forward, all education sectors can embrace these best ideas and these best practices of how to surround kids with the best education possible. One of the things we found is smaller schools do matter. And let's not be afraid to design small schools, but let's tap them into larger systems of accountability and support and master teaching and excellent curriculum so that each little school isn't left in isolation. But small does matter, particularly at the elementary level. We're so interested in talking about class size, and I'm thankful to see smaller cohorts, etc. But let's talk school size. That's where community is, and that's where the health and the happiness happens, even in times of crisis. But I think going forward, that's where it'll be in times of innovation.
I would actually second that the school systems that were able to be very creative with their teaching force and actually design very personalized responses. So one large school system in North Carolina, actually, Guilford County, last summer, took their master teachers, the teachers who were absolutely prima and practiced with content mastery and delivery, and they taped a bunch of lessons that were then deployed in the fall. And the master teachers played the role of, high level instruction. And then other teachers and para teachers and so forth were tasked with keeping kids in little micro communities, whether virtual or in person, that held them together in a social and moral and academic framework. So those are the kinds of creative things that can really help in these situations and going forward.
I'm struck by your conversation on really two fronts. Number one, I'm thinking about the parents. I have to kind of note, as an observer of COVID-19, March 12th comes along and all of a sudden parents become educators against their will. What possibilities does that have for the future? What might we have learned by that? And Ashley, I can't help but think of some of the work that you've done on education pluralism, and Dini, the work you've done on educational diversity here in Canada. Does COVID-19's impact on the disruption of education create new possibilities for both of these fronts? I'm really, really interested in that. And how long will it take for that to happen?
It certainly, yes, it has. You're absolutely right. There have been real disruptions that I would favor, in the end, that have, multiple states have passed an expansion of tax credits and educational savings accounts and expanded vouchers and so forth. And I think that's quite good. I don't think we can let go of the need for public accountability and quality, because I can tell you, working in every school sector, from the standpoint of providing services and advice to them, there's such variability in the quality in every school sector between schools. And this is something we can all work on together by strengthening all kinds of schools to deliver excellent education, instruction, and also a really robust community.
I think it's such an important question. What is the role of parents? And we all know, our governments knew in their hearts, parents are the primary educators. Parents have the primary responsibility. We know that. Nature tells us that. And we've actually lived that in the last year. When there was a crisis, go home, kids. And so we know that, and we know that that's baked into the various UN statements on the rights of the child, statements on the primacy of parents as primary educators and have the primary right to make decisions about their kids' education. So we've just all had a great experiential opportunity to embrace that philosophical understanding that we all kind of know deep in our hearts. So I think we should live into that, and that is indeed the second thing that I would want to say. When we're designing these interestingly autonomous schools, small but connected into these larger networks and supports, let's think about how can we better embrace the role of parents going forward? Again, regardless of system, parents care so deeply for their kids and want what's best for their kids. Every parent does. We embrace that in so many of our other systems in the social work programs, and parents first. And that's what we should really be working on. And that's a huge place of hope going forward as we redesign our education systems going forward to embrace more technology, more interesting school design and delivery of excellent education.
You know, I can't help, just as we kind of close this conversation, asking you, is it political solutions that we're looking for here? Is it cultural solutions that we're looking for here? Maybe a bit of both, but just as we close, give me a quick sense. Ashley, we'll start with you. How much politics do we need to happen here, and government and legislation to reform education? And how much do we need cultural change, and maybe change even within parents and families toward education flourishing?
So I think there's definitely the need for bipartisan political action where stakeholders and policymakers from across the political spectrum can come together and say, let's enable all distinctive schools that really reflect parents' needs and values and that are also accountable to the public for the common good. So we need bipartisan compromise, and it's wonderful when this happens, and it can still happen. That's the first thing. I think in this country, in my country, the cultural shift is often around instruction. It's hard for someone who doesn't live in the States to understand this, but the United States historically under-challenges our kids intellectually. And this is true across all the sectors. There are always very elite prep schools that are high, intellectual challenge on steroids, sometimes too much so that it can harm kids, but the vast majority under challenges. So now is the time to step up, to not remediate, but to accelerate learning. And that's my hope.
Deanie, 30 seconds, politics or culture?
It's a fabulous question. Is it policy? Is it philosophy is the way I'd say it. And I love both. I think policy can set the groundwork for allowing the flourishing, the innovation, and diverse philosophical approaches to education to be designed and delivered. But we need good policy settings. And if we have a heavy burden and the barriers to entry with diverse options in education are so heavy, it will diminish the creativity of those of us that are ready to go to bring communities together and design and build beautiful education spaces. We need both good policy and amazing folks dialed into the big questions of education.
Deanie, thank you very much. Ashley, great conversation. I look forward to having many more of those in the future. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go to just a final quick conversation with our discussion desk before we close it up for the evening. We're heading close to 9 o'clock. We may hit a little past 9 o'clock, but let's go to Robert and to Lisa one more time.
Hey, Robert,
Lisa,
you go ahead.
Robert, here's the question I want to ask as we kind of exit this education conversation and we look through the rest of the evening. Much of the news, much of the media is about money, is about technical things, is about finance. And even as I listened to the last conversation on education, I thought, is this COVID-19 exit a lot less about money and more about heart? Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the things that we sort of saw, by the way, when we were going through this white paper report is something that social scientists sort of describe as the Matthew effect, the kind of, where the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Those who were already well positioned were able to weather the storm really successfully. And those who were poorly positioned, even what they had was taken away. And that positioning, interestingly enough, this is, I think, one of the real key takeaways from this pandemic, had less to do with the dollars and cents in people's bank accounts and more to do with the resilience of the communities in which they were embedded. It had to do with how things were going at home with mom and dad. It had to do with how things were going with parental involvement in the school association, right? How well you knew your neighbors, whether you could get groceries or not. And what it looked like to check in on loved ones, you know, and the elderly and so on. So, I mean, that was one of the really crucial things that we found. Dollars and cents are important. There's no question about it. And we've got to have those debates. But I think this pandemic showed us that the fundamental wealth gap, as it were, is not about dollars. It may just be about bedtime stories and family board games.
Lisa, thoughts on that as we close?
Yes, I agree. I think that this experience has prompted us, all of us, to think about what's really important in life, what's really meaningful. And we all realize in our heart of hearts that material goods are not what brings us meaning ultimately. And I think what I was really struck by in reading the pandemic pivot paper that Dini and colleagues recently wrote was, first of all, about how these independent schools had a community, as they were saying in this last panel, had a community. And so that when a crisis occurred, people rallied together. They already had the shared mission, they had the relationships. And so they were able to very effectively pivot to the online learning without, in some cases, losing a day of instruction. And there are many other examples of that where we, in a crisis, realize that we have a community to fall back on or that we don't. And perhaps tomorrow we can talk about the loneliness epidemic that we have in Canada and some of the research we've done on that, and the very high percentage of Canadians who say they have nobody to rely on in a moment of need, which is very troubling.
Okay, we're going to pick it up with both of you tomorrow. I look forward to spending a bit of time with you tomorrow. Thank you very much for those remarks.
Yeah, thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I want to give you a special invitation to join us tomorrow night at the same time, 7:30 Eastern. Invite a friend or family member who might be interested to join you as we continue this discussion on how to exit COVID toward what matters most. So, coming up tomorrow, is childcare for the child or for the roaring economy? What are the leading experts saying on the future of charity in Canada? Can we still call it charity? And how did the church really fare? And how in the world do you love your neighbor from your armchair? And of course, civil society in the new digital world. Is it possible? Also, tomorrow night, we have assembled a fascinating panel of next generation leaders. How do they see the future? Is it a hopeful one or is it a helpless one? So join us and put your fingerprints on the future of Canada. On behalf of the whole Cardus team, Extreme Line Productions, and many people, including some of you, who helped make this tonight possible, thank you, God bless you, and good night.